Alrighty. Can everyone see me? Excellent.
Yes, nice shirt.
Hey, represent, man. So thanks everyone for coming to the UTIG seminar today. I know things are a little bit different as the world changes to keep up with the growing pandemic. I'm here to introduce Kristine DeLong, who was our seminar speaker a couple weeks ago, actually right before we hit quarantine. We managed to keep her at her home, keep her safe. And so now she's joining us virtually from Louisiana, staying safe hopefully out there. Kristine is in the, we call it in the family, so to speak, because she is from the lab. She got her PhD with Terry when he was still at South Florida, Terry Quinn, the previous UTIG director, who's now NSF. She got her PhD with him in 2008 at South Florida, and she really championed how to subsample the corals that we use for paleoclimate with the micromill that our wonderful Uncle Fred Taylor found for us. So she really helped to refine that technique to help paleoclimate reduce uncertainties in these coral reconstructions and really champion that. And since then, she is now a professor, associate professor, I believe, out at LSU, and has since branched out from coral archives to other archives, such as shells and trees. And today, I believe she's going to talk to us about some really cool trees that were found during the last ice age. So with that, I will hand it over to Kristine, stop my video, and let her take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm glad we were able to do this virtually. I really was sad that I couldn't come and visit in person a couple weeks ago.
Sorry, I would also ask that all participants out there, please mute your microphones. I think I can take care of that mute all.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
So, oh, it said it muted me.
Apologies. Yeah, I muted all.
Okay.
Forgive me. Take it away, Kristine.
Can you hear me now? Yes?
Affirmative.
Okay.
Yep.
So I'm glad I can do this presentation virtually. So this is some of the work that I started doing back in 2012. And this, actually the way I came upon this whole topic and this site was I saw a post on Facebook from a dive shop over in Alabama that I had liked at some point, talking about swimming with dinosaurs. And I'm like, what? So I looked at the story and contacted the reporter who wrote the article about how there's all these tree stumps out on the seafloor out in the Gulf of Mexico. And I told him I was a scientist and I studied past climate. And he says, well, you want to come and dive this site? And I'm like, yeah. So I grabbed my dive gear, drove over to Orange Beach, and went out and dove the site. And so that's how all of this got started. But it's a pretty cool project. You'll see from my co-author list, there's quite a few people involved in this project. My role in this is kind of as a lead investigator is coordinating the research, bringing in experts and students to work on this pretty unique site that we have out in the Gulf of Mexico. So this is the study site offshore, looking at it there from the dive boat. And just to orient you on a map, here we're looking at the northern Gulf Coast. You'll see Louisiana over there to your left, and the Mississippi River Delta, the state of Mississippi, and then the Alabama coast with Mobile Bay and Florida. Offshore, we have the Mississippi, Florida sand sheet. So for those of us who dive, this is a pretty boring place to dive. It's just sand out there. There's not a whole lot of things to see, and local dive shops like to sink different things out there like silos and small airplanes. So they have something to dive, and fish tend to congregate around these areas. So the way this site was found was in late 2004, a fisherman was kind of cruising around with his fish finder going and noticed there's this particular spot where he was picking up a lot of fish, and he was actually found it was a good place to get red snapper. So he kept going back to the site, you know, time after time, year after year, and it's just lots of fish at this site. So finally he talked to a local dive shop and had somebody go dive the site to see why were all these fish congregating. And what he found was all of these stumps on the seafloor. So what we're thinking is what happened is Hurricane Ivan came through here in 2004, so just before the fishermen found the site. And Hurricane Ivan was a particularly strong storm out in the Gulf. It was a Category 5. And it produced some really high wave heights, some of the highest wave heights recorded, so almost 90 feet. And a lot of the NOAA buoys out on the shelf actually had quite a bit of scour happen around their bases, and we lost quite a few of those buoys during this storm. So what we think happened was Hurricane Ivan produced enough wave height to scour out the site and expose these trees that were previously buried. And you'll also see on this map in these white contour lines, that is the time of the erosional base there from the last glacial maximum, but I'll come back to that in a minute. All right, so what you're gonna see when we go out and dive the site is bald cypress stumps. So for those of you who don't know a lot about bald cypress, we find those here all along the Gulf Coast. They like to live in areas where you have water, areas that regularly flood, close to rivers. They tend to grow in locations with elevations up to about 50 meters, but they can go as high as 100 meters. And as you can see from this map that you do find them going all the way up the Mississippi River into almost the Midwest there, and then along the East Coast all the way up to Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay area. But you know, these are trees that they tend to not tolerate a lot of snow, a lot of freezing temperatures. They can withstand some below freezing temperatures, but they tend to occur in those subtropical humid areas closer to the coastlines, but not right on the coast. They don't really tolerate a whole lot of salt water either. So what we're gonna see when we go dive the site is the trees obviously are not there with their leaves anymore. What we mostly have is those stumps. So if this red line here shows if we were to cut this tree off at the stump, you see this really interesting outline that you see for cypress trees, like this beautiful table here. So this is kind of what you're gonna see underwater, is these stumps with this very unique shape that tells you it's a bald cypress tree. So let's go diving, and I'll show a short video here of the stumps. So this part, we're still out on the sand sheet. We haven't got to the part where the trees are really exposed. So this is out on the sand ledge. So in diving, we've counted over 50 of these trees out there on the seafloor that have been exposed. Some of them can get quite large, so almost 5 feet in diameter. So I'll move on from there because it gets kind of Blair Witchish there with the camera moving back and forth. But here's some still shots from that video where you could see that stump in the background. So here's a shot of me coring one of these stumps underwater. And this core, we're actually going to use that to do some radiocarbon dating on the wood. And here's another screen grab of one of the stumps underwater. This one's actually in the ledge or down in the depression, right next to the ledge where the trees are exposed. And this is another shot of one of those stumps that we actually was able to float up to the surface. So you can see some of these pieces of wood are quite large. So one of the questions that comes to mind is, why is this wood so well preserved 10 miles offshore? Because wood normally in the marine environment will become home to a lot of shipworms and other biodegraders. so it doesn't last too long out in the ocean. So finding these stumps offshore and in growth position is just not something you expect to find. So originally when I talked with the reporter about this site, he told me, well, we're out in 60 foot of water. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about the sea level curves and saying, okay, this is about 10 to 12,000 years ago. That's really exciting. So wanted me to push forward with this research. So thinking about how do we get tree stumps in growth position offshore? So the way that happens is through changes in sea level. And this particular image shows the Gulf Coast at the last glacial maximum about 18,000 years ago. And the red star is showing the approximate location of the forest at the time of the last glacial maximum. The yellow star is Baton Rouge, just to orient you. So just to kind of keep in mind what happens on the Gulf Coast as we go through the ice ages, as sea level drops, the continental shelf is being exposed. And you can see the state of Florida here. So at the last glacial maximum, it's almost twice as wide as it is today. So as sea level drops, this land is now exposed and can be colonized with plants and animals to come in and take advantage of that new land as space. So this is what we're thinking happened to get these tree stumps offshore at the water depths that we're finding them. So I'll pull back up this geophysical map from Bartek back in 2004 that shows you what this erosional surface looks like at our study site when we go back to the last glacial maximum. So Mobile Bay here is to the north. There's a river system that feeds into the bay, but as you drop sea level, and around it, you get these higher plains to the east and to the west. The red boxes are study site. So you can almost imagine at the last glacial maximum, this site was inland. It's in a place that probably had some small creeks and bayous going through it. So a perfect place for bald cypress trees to grow. So coming back to that question of how do you preserve wood over long time periods? So one of the things you need is to have burial in anoxic sediments. And bald cypress in particularly grow in a great place for this to happen. And this is these backwater swamps. They fill up with water, but there's really not a lot of moving water, and there's no wave action, and there's no seasonal overturning because we don't really freeze down here in the south. So this water can become anoxic very quickly. So there's no oxygen in it, and any organic matter that goes into the water will be well preserved. So the other thing that can happen is we do have floods, and floods bring in sediment. So this gives us a mechanism to bury this wood quickly. And then you need that wood to, or that site to not have any erosional processes happen through time. So this would allow you to preserve this wood for long time periods. And we know about petrified wood. So this wood's definitely not petrified. It's still wood. So the pictures here I'm showing is from some of the wood that we collected out diving. So we brought back 23 pieces of wood. We cut those up between the two different labs working in southern Mississippi and LSU. So I've got pictures of Grant here with the chainsaw actually cutting the wet wood that we brought up. And surprisingly, the wood is very much intact. You can see here from picture J that as we cut it, the inside of this still looks like pretty fresh wood that's just wet. And we do find that with a lot of the wood that we've recovered. This bottom picture here, K and J, this is actually a palm tree that was brought up. So we just didn't get bald cypress wood. There's also other trees down there as well. So just to kind of show you as an example that, yes, we can have stumps buried quickly and preserved. So this is a picture from a site that's actually really close to LSU where they were building a road. And as they started digging down deep, they started to come across these huge bald cypress stumps. And you can see Paul from the Louisiana Geological Survey standing next to one. And there's actually quite a few here in the background as well. And this particular stump has now been dated and it's Holocene, so about 4,000 years old. So what Paul thinks happened was this particular area was a bayou of the off the Mississippi River in the past, where you had these upper point bar formations that had these depressions that would have been a really good place for bald cypress trees to grow. And then as the river moved, you get these overbank sediments start to bury the wood, and then over time, and after the channel has been abandoned, you get this burial of the trees over long periods of time. And with no oxygen in those sediments, the wood is preserved. So that's how we can have this happen on land. But now we're going to look at what happens offshore. So what we've done through this study is brought in people to do geophysical research. We've also done some coring work to really understand the site. So this map is showing the summary of our field work back in 2015 and 2016, where we mapped the bathymetry of the site. So we've got north is towards the top of the page. And what you can see on the Mississippi, Florida sand sheet is we get this ridge and trough formation that tends to happen all across the sand sheet. So to the east, we have the sand ridge, and then it dips down into a trough. And this trough is where it's been scoured out, and where I've got that yellow star is where we have tree stumps. And that yellow star is right about the position where we have that 5-foot diameter tree stump. And then down in this depression, there is wood all along this ledge that's eroding out, and then there's large stumps here in this bottom deepest part of the depression. And in the picture I showed you of that log that was floated up to the surface, that was actually down here at this deepest part of this depression. So the area with the red dashed line is the approximate area where we have those tree stumps sitting on the surface. So some other work that we're trying to do with the geophysical research is kind of map where all of these tree stumps are exposed. But we also want to see, can we find trees that are still buried? So this is showing some of the images that one of our graduate students worked on for his PhD, looking at areas where we have potential contacts of trees on the seafloor. And then here's a map of the site showing our potential contacts and contacts that are still buried. So those are tree stumps. The other things we've done is gone out and vibracored the site. We did this work back in 2015 and 2016 with our little shrimp boat up here that's been re-outfitted to do coring work, so the coastal profiler. So here's the team. This is from 2015, getting ready to deploy the vibracore. And the very first core that we brought back to the surface, this is what we found at the bottom, is this really rich organic peat. And if you look closely, you can actually see little pieces of roots and stems. And there's a piece of wood over here and a piece of wood at the bottom. So in 2015, pretty much every core we brought up, we were hitting wood and had chunks of wood in the core catcher. So this was pretty exciting that we were definitely finding the forest out there in our cores. And the longest core we were able to recover was 4.9 meters. So, and here's a core image from that core. So showing this top 3 meters is pretty much sand. So we have these Holocene sand facies throughout the core. And then when we get down to about 3 meters, this starts to shift into interbedded sand and mud. And then about at 4 meters, we start to get into this organic rich peat and mud. And you'll see that it kind of waxes and wanes throughout the core as we go down to the bottom of the core. The image to the far right, this is just the bottom of this core expanded into a closer view, showing our sampling depths for our microfossil analysis and pollen analysis, then also for our radiocarbon dates. So one of the first things we did once we started getting wood from the site is doing some radiocarbon dates. And the picture over here on the upper right is one of those pieces of wood that we collected diving. And the surprising thing was that all the wood was coming back radiocarbon dead. So that was surprising because initially I'm thinking, okay, this site's about 10 to 12,000 years old if it's down at, 18 meters. But the surprise is nope, it's actually a lot older. So we dated quite a bit of wood and then also wood that we recovered from these cores. We were able to get a couple of dates that came back. So one was from 4.05 meters, and that date came back as about 41,380 years. And then below that, we had another date come back as 37,350 years. But that particular sample we redated, and when we redated, it came back as radiocarbon dead. So this suggests that our wood in the site is older than about 50,000 years. So we decided to take a second approach to dating the site, and that was doing optical stimulated luminescence dating of the sediments that was just above our mud and peat sections in our sediment cores. So this gives us an approximate age for the site of between 74 to 50,000 years ago. So this puts us right into marine isotope stage 4. So the red dots here are our OSL dates and the green are those radiocarbon dates. So we're pretty confident at this point that the forest was alive during the earliest part of the last glacial interval. So as we come out of the previous interglacial, as sea levels dropping and that continental shelf is becoming exposed, the trees and the forest is starting to grow in place. So we think the forest is alive during this interval here. But one of the things that's interesting to note is during the Ice Age, sea level just doesn't drop. You get these quick pulses of sea level rise occurring during this interval as well. So we're going to use that later in one of our hypotheses was preserved to that towards the end of the talk. So we also did one radiocarbon date at 3.3 meters depth. And this was from forams that we were collecting in the sediment core. So this is the lowest we could go and collect enough forams to do a radiocarbon date. And this date comes back 3,940 years. So we know at this part of the core, we're in the Holocene. But then as we get down to about 4 meters, we're now in the Pleistocene. So somewhere between 3 to 4 meters, we have our disconformity. And that was a target of one of our students, was trying to find where this switch from the Holocene to the Pleistocene took place in the cores and locating that erosional surface. So here's a summary of the foram work that JT worked on for his master's. So looking at our longest core here, I'm also showing here the gamma density, the grain size, and loss on ignition data from this core, along with his forams. And most of these forams are benthic forams that live in the open ocean. But as we go down core, we'll start to see these assemblages switching to more forams that are growing closer, or they live closer to the coast or in estuaries. And then the forams completely are gone by the time we get down to 3.8 meters. So we're pretty confident that in this interval is where we have that erosional surface. And then the blue line here, I just threw up to show where we had that radiocarbon date of about 4,000 years ago in the core. So this matches with what we see in the foram data, that the site is fully marine when we get down to 3.3 meters, but below that, we're in this transitional zone before we go into the full section with the Pleistocene sediments. So this map is showing you all of the core locations from the site. So we collected 18 cores in total. Some of these sites we reoccupied in 2016, so we could do those OSL dates. And some of the sites we did duplicates. So one core went through the core logger for gamma density, and the other one was used for OSL. So again, just to show you where this longest core, 15BF1, where we had wood in the bottom and the core catcher. So this is off to the east of the exposure site, and we did have wood in the bottom of that core. We had wood in the bottom of DF2. over here at 16 DF7, we have wood here. So all of these cores in this red circle area, we had wood. So as we move over to the east, close to this sand ridge, here we started to see a shift in the sediments and no wood in the bottom of these cores over here to the east. So we think the forest site is in this area here to the west. And here's just a close-up of some of the facies in the different sediment cores. So 15 DF1 that I'm showing you here has facies 1, the Holocene sand, those interbedded sand and mud, and then the Pleistocene interbedded mud and peat layers. As we move to the east, we start to see more of these interbedded sand and mud layers that are Pleistocene in age, and then also a paleosol here at our easternmost location at the site. So this paleosol is interesting because it suggests that we have a location that was exposed and had some erosion going on. So I'll also throw up another one of our geophysical maps here, showing at the top the uninterpreted and the bottom the interpreted image from the site. So really close to where this ledge is. So it's this line here from A prime to prime, where we have the sand and mud in the cores at the site. So now just kind of pulling all this core information together and looking at a cross section going from east to west. In the sediment cores here to the west, you'll see those peats and muds where we find wood. We see our transgressive surface, the sequence boundary, the dates from our OSL dates, and the radiocarbon dates from the forams. So we can start to build this picture of what the site looks like as we go back in time. And we start to see we have potentially what looks like some higher elevations and then a depression here to the west where these mud and peats are collecting. So this is the digital elevation model that was built from the geophysical data. So the top layer, you can see the modern Mississippi, Florida sand sheet. Here's that sand ridge, and then the depression, the white dashed line is where the trees stumps are exposed. And then this middle layer is that transgressive surface. And then the bottom here is the basal surface. So you can see it looks like we have here to the east what might have been a natural levee or higher elevation in the past. But as we move over to the west, we start to see these depressions that are starting to form. And this is potentially that backwater swamp area where the trees were living, and then having these pools of anoxic water and places for all of this sediment to be preserved over time. So now kind of switching over to the paleoclimate side, some of the work that we've done so far, first we looked at this longest core, 15 DF1 that we've been looking at, and we did pollen analysis throughout this core. So the pollen analysis starts here at about 3 meters going down core. And some of the interesting things we find is a lot of pollen that's very typical of what we find today along the Gulf Coast. So to summarize the pollen results, I'll walk you through another one of these diagrams showing the different species of pollen here across the top, and then the depth of the sediment core over here on the left. So at the very bottom of the core, we find pollen assemblages that are very similar to what we find today along the Gulf Coast for a modern swamp. We have our bald cypress trees, there's some oak and hickory, we have tupelo, and then also we see some of our sedge grasses as well. So as we move up core, we see that this shifts to something that we'd see closer to the coastline today, that's more of an open forest grass area, but we still have some bald cypress and alder pollen that's showing up, but we see now we have the shift to a lot more grass occurring in this area. So as we move up core to about 4.2 meters, now we're getting into an assemblage that looks like a levee bar forest. So something that's a lot closer to the coastline. And this particular assemblage was one that's quite unique. The modern equivalent that we could find for this particular pollen assemblage actually occurs today up here in coastal North Carolina. So this suggests that this tree assemblage, it's not similar to what we find on the Gulf Coast today, but something from the subtropics, but at a higher elevation, thus you could infer colder temperatures for this assemblage, but also closer to the marine environment. And then as we move up to 4 meters, the pollen assemblage switches completely over to grass, what you'd find along the coastline with your saltwater grass marshes that you see today. And then above 4 meters, we switch into a complete marine environment with no pollen. So we infer that this is the Holocene section of that core. So other things we found in the peat sections of the core is seeds. And we've been working with Beth Middleton over at the USGS in Lafayette, who does a lot of work with seeds in our coastal areas and along the Mississippi River. And the first time she took a look at some of the core catcher sediments in my lab, she started to pick out these bald cypress seeds. So this is some exciting work that we're finding, that seeds are well preserved in these cores. And when I told Beth how old they were, she was kind of like dumbfounded, like, oh my gosh, I didn't think these seeds would last that long. So one of the things we're going to start doing in phase 2 of this project is doing some more work with the seeds and pulling those out of the sediment core. And we may even try to germinate some of them. She doesn't think the bald cypress trees will germinate because they typically are not viable after a couple of years, but some of these other seeds we may actually be able to get them to grow. But we're going to give that a try in phase 2 of the project. So other things we've done with the wood that we collected diving is we tried to do a tree ring reconstruction. So one of the things that was really interesting is a lot of the pieces of wood has bark still on it. So you can see that in a couple of the, and here's a picture of one of the larger pieces of wood, and then it's blown up so that you can see those rings in the cypress trees. So these big holes that you're seeing, these are actually holes made by shipworms, and you can see a shipworm shell down here in this bottom one. So that's what this white thing is. But one of the interesting things we started to notice in the wood was that the rings in all of the pieces of wood we collected, they're very small. So this starts to tell us that, yes, the trees are growing, but they're a little more stressed than what they would normally be. And that could be due to either colder temperatures or potentially they don't have the growing conditions that they would like, so maybe less precipitation. And another thing we started to explore was how close they were to the ocean and potential saltwater intrusion, because that can also reduce growth in bald cypress trees. So this is our floating reconstruction from the site. So we collected 23 pieces of wood diving. We were actually able to cross date 10 of those, which to me is just unbelievable, because when we go out to do tree ring work, we pick particular trees and we're very particular with the type of trees we pick, and we just don't randomly go and pick up wood on the forest floor and expect it to cross date. But that's essentially what we did here, was just pick up random pieces of wood on the seafloor, and we're able to cross date them. So what this diagram shows you is over here at 500, so this would be the bark edge of the tree, and then as we go back in time, we're going back to the youngest part of the tree. The gray shaded area is showing us the number of series or trees that we were able to cross date. So the oldest chronology goes back almost 500 years. So one of these trees, we were able to get 500 years of rings out of it. So some of the smaller ones, we got just about 200 years out of those pieces of wood. So what we see as we go from the youngest part of the record towards the bark edge is, one of the things you'll notice is the variance changes quite a bit. And this is mostly due to how many trees are included in that series. So when we get to about 150 years, here we have enough confidence in the record that what we're seeing is more of an environmental climate signal. So we have enough trees at this point, and that's 4 trees. So as we move towards the bark edge, we'll see that that variance starts to become reduced. And we notice that there's these events that start to happen, where there's these suppressions of growth and then a recovery, a suppression of growth, a recovery. Then we get this large event that happens from about 375 years to about 425, where tree growth is greatly reduced. And then we get this large stress event at about 430 years. Then after this point, you get a recovery. So when trees are stressed, you may have trees that die back, an open canopy, so other trees can grow faster. So that might be what's driving this recovery point here. But then after this recovery, you see that growth starts to become reduced again. And then all of the trees that we were able to cross date die at the same time. So this was one of these really interesting products that came out of doing this work. And this is all in a paper that we currently have in review. So another thing we did with the tree ring chronologies was try to see how does this chronology compare to other bald cypress chronologies throughout the area. So this is showing the Gini coefficients. So as these colors become red and start to match our chronology offsite, you can infer that our chronology from marine isotope stage 4, that these trees are experiencing similar conditions today. So this would be up the Mississippi River Valley, so definitely farther north, where they do get some periodic or irregular freezes in the wintertime and potentially some snow. Then also here inland along the South Carolina to North Carolina coast. So they do not look like the trees we have today in Florida and along the Gulf Coast and over here in Texas. So we can infer that, you know, these trees were experiencing climate conditions that were colder than what we see today along the Gulf Coast, but not cold enough to make bald cypress trees not conducive for them to inhabit this newly exposed land. So kind of pulling together what we have so far from our geophysical data and our paleoclimate work is what we think happened at the site. So here I've got a map where we're back at marine isotope stage 4, where sea level is falling. And the black square is showing our forest location, the exposed continental shelf, the Mississippi River and its Lanyap Delta that was forming during this time. So you could tell that the forest was quite a bit of ways inland. And depending on the exact time that the forest was alive, this could have been anywhere from 40 to 60 meters above sea level and anywhere from 50 to 100 kilometers inland. So we were definitely not coastal when the site or when the trees were alive. We're a good ways inland, but this is very typical of what we see along the Gulf Coast today is we have our bald cypress forests. They can grow quite a ways inland. So now as we move from this falling sea level stage, so during the ice age, we get these pulses of where sea level increases quite quickly. So one of our hypotheses is this is a potential burial mechanism for this site. So as we get this quick pulse of sea level rise during the ice age, we get floodplain aggregation that's occurring, and this can provide sediments to bury the trees and the stumps, and thus preserving them as we move forward through the end of the ice age. So then we're going to move forward here to the glass glacial maximum, and where we have sea levels going to reach its lowest level during the ice age. We still have our Lanyap Delta and our river deltas forming, and this site is still further inland and buried. Some erosion is happening, like we see with that paleosol in one of our cores, but there's enough sediment that's buried the site that we don't lose all of the forest sediments. So then as we move forward through the deglacial, sea level is rising. We have the site go into marine conditions where we start to see these interbedded sands and muds. in the Holocene, and then finally to today where we have modern open marine conditions at the site. So what we're working on for phase 2, so this was awarded to us just last fall from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So in phase 2, what we're going to do is go back out to the site, and we're going to bring in a 3D chirp system from the UK. And with this chirp system, we're hoping we can map the extents of the forest at our primary site to see if we have more trees to the west and to the north, and where the locations of these trees are. We're also going to go back out with a longer vibracoring system, and we're going to take the point SIR out to do this work. We're hoping to get through that whole peat section back to our last interglacial surface with this core work, so we can have a complete sequence of what's happening during the marine isotope stage 4, going back to 5 at our site for paleoclimate reconstructions. And then a little bit of interesting news happened this week. Back in December, I've been working with a group out of Amherst who does shipworm research. So they went out and dove the site in December and was able to collect some wood as well. And the New York Times published a really nice article on their research this was Wednesday. So you can take a look at that in the New York Times, talking about their shipworm research and what they're looking at with the shipworms. What they're interested in is, because this wood is so old and it's in a location you normally wouldn't have wood, would shipworms come in and colonize this wood and start to decompose it, but would they get any unique shipworm species? And they're interested in looking at these shipworms for potential novel chemicals that can be used for medical applications. So just fascinating work that one of my questions is, this wood's been out there in the marine environment for, we think, 10,000 to 12,000 years. So why, or has this site ever been exposed by another hurricane during that whole time period? So trying to figure out how that would happen, one of the ways we could do that is shipworms. So if the site had been exposed, that wood would be colonized with shipworms, and we should see that evidence in the wood. And shipworms can leave little calcium carbonate tubes and their shells in there, and we can go in and radiocarbon date those. So that'll tell me, has this wood been exposed in the past? So that's one of the things we're going to do here in phase 2, is try to understand, what was happening with hurricanes in the past, and was this site ever exposed? And if you think about the northern Gulf Coast, we have a lot of hurricanes. And I find it just really hard to believe we didn't have a category 5 in the past not expose this wood in the last 10 to 15,000 years. So that's something we're doing with the shipworm research. So here's just some fun photos here at the end from doing our field work with our team of researchers and students, going out diving, doing core work, and doing the geophysical work. So I'll thank the team here. There's a whole bunch of us. It's been a really great project to work on. We're excited to be funded for phase 2. We'll be doing that research. We were hoping to do it this summer, but all of that's been pushed back. Hopefully we'll get out there this fall with the 3D chirp system and start doing some more vibracoring. We'll also be going out and diving the site, doing some more mapping work, and potentially looking at another site that we found in Alabama where we have tree stumps exposed. We have a third site over in Mississippi, just south of Dolphin Island, that researchers from Southern Miss are finding wood in their sediment cores. So we're going to go over there and investigate that site as well. And then we have a fourth site over in Florida, just south of where Hurricane Michael made landfall, where we have some tree stumps that were exposed. And this particular site happened to be one that Florida Fish and Wildlife were managing as an artificial reef. And after Hurricane Michael came through, they went out to check the site, and they noticed that there was a ship down there. and the shipwreck had moved, and as it moved, it scoured the bottom, and there's tree stumps exposed there as well. So we're starting to think we have this kind of bathtub ring around the northern Gulf Coast of these last ice age tree stumps and these paleo landscapes preserved in the sediments. So I'll wrap up there and just kind of point you towards, there is a documentary that's been done on the forest. It's called The Underwater Forest, that my friend and colleague, who I first talked to about the site, Ben Rains, has produced. So if you have time while you're home during quarantine looking for things to do, it's just a 30-minute video. Take a quick look at that. We will be doing a sequel to this as we go out and do phase 2 research here in the next couple of years. And I think we have some time for questions. Do we, Jud?
Yes, we do. I first want to thank you for a wonderful talk. You can clap if you wish on the participant side. I'll give you the audio for the whole room. Awesome. Very interesting talk. There we go. People got some claps going on now.
Yay! Thank you.
Fun talk, Kristine. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions from people. You can just click on the raise hand, and if there are no raised hands, you can just unmute. If it gets quiet, feel free to chime in. Charles, go for it.
Hi, yeah, thank you. It was a very nice talk. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the type of climate proxies these trees would be? You mentioned something about saltwater intrusion, and it was like temperature. Just kind of what climate conditions would they tell us about?
Right. So this is one of those things I've been really interested in. One of our grad students has been working with coastal bald cypress and pine trees, looking at the impacts of saltwater intrusion on the trees. So when we first started working on the project, we thought that these trees were a little closer to the coastline. And, as we got into doing, starting to pull all the data together, we quickly realized, nope, these are not coastal trees, they're inland. So we don't think saltwater intrusion is really impacting the trees now, but they're definitely, their growth is not what you'd normally see for trees or bald cypress trees today along the Gulf Coast. So this suggests that they're stressed in some way. Tree ring studies in the Southeast are a little difficult, and that's because we have great growing conditions. So our trees are not stressed. So typically, if you think about the Southwest, where we have a lot of great tree ring reconstructions, that's for a place that's arid. So the trees are stressed by not having enough water. Or you have, tree ring reconstructions that are kind of circle the Arctic Circle or high elevations. And that's because those trees are very sensitive to temperature. So in the Southeast, trees are a little more difficult because they're happy trees, they grow, so they don't really get these stress years that we need to do the cross dating that dendrochronologists do to form their reconstructions. So this has been one of those things it's interesting to see what we see in these trees, that there's definitely a lot of stress events that are occurring. So that could be from either temperature or it could be from precipitation. So which one it is, I can't say yet, but it's some of the things that we're exploring. So I've been talking with one of my colleagues out at University of Arizona, Marcus, I cannot pronounce his last name because it's Swedish properly, but he does a lot of work with climate models during this time interval. And so we definitely see some shifts that are occurring in the jet stream, where we could be having, colder winters that are occurring, but the summers are not, I would think they're not getting as cold as what we would think during an ice age. Looking at other pollen studies that have been done in the past, there's some pollen studies that suggest that we have, trees that we find like in upstate New York and in New England that those trees are living along the Gulf Coast. And it's definitely not what we're seeing. I may actually have one of those pictures here. Here we go. So this is actually from the Ruddiman textbook. So, you know, looking at the glacial pollen records, you see these spruce trees all the way down to the Gulf Coast. And from this site, we definitely do not find spruce, and we definitely do not find elm. So, so this suggests that maybe that pollen was transported by rivers or through the atmosphere down to these sites where they're doing pollen studies in the Southeast US. So we don't see anything that looks like spruce or elm in our sediment cores. So this kind of for pollen studies is providing, you know, some data that we just don't have for, you know, the glacial interval. So does that kind of answer your question, Charles?
Oh yeah, very good. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, Kirk.
Sorry, just had to find the unmute button. So I have another question about the tree rings. So these bald cypress, the stumps look pretty chaotic in terms of how they grow. So how do you track a consistent growth line through the stump for 500 years when it's constantly changing and you don't know if you're going towards the edge or back to the center or?
Right. Yeah, so that's been one of those things that Grant and I have been talking about, because the pieces of wood that we did this cross-dated chronology with, they're just pieces of wood we recovered from the seafloor. So they're not from like a stump like we would do today. We go out and core the base of the trees right above the buttresses. So yeah, so these are just random pieces on the seafloor. So things that look like roots or branches, we did not include those. So yes, we don't know exactly where in the tree we are. So that is one of the things that we've been thinking about. And Grant's been exploring some tools that kind of help you look at the ring structure to see where you're at in the tree. So yeah. My student who just his dissertation work, he tried to do some cross-dating work with pond cypress, which is a subspecies of bald cypress, and they're notoriously difficult to cross-date. And he went to a site down in Lake Pontchartrain where they had a lot of saltwater intrusion, and he was hoping that those trees were stressed enough that he would be able to cross-date them. And he was able to only cross-date about 30% of the wood he collected. So again, it's, the bald cypress trees can be difficult to cross-date. So, but I was very surprised that Grant was able to pull this together as much as he was. Does that kind of answer your question?
Oh, that's perfect, thanks.
Any other questions out there? I don't see any raised hands. Feel free, if you can't find that, to unmute and ask. Give us a second as people try and find. Charles again.
Sorry, since nobody else was asking anything, can you explain a little bit more what a Gini coefficient involves?
Oh gosh. All right, you're asking me a question I don't know a whole lot about. So from what I understand how the Gini coefficient works is we look at the tree ring chronology, and it's looking at those barcodes to see what's similar to it. So the exact mathematics behind that, I'm not fully up on, but I know what you're looking at is things that are similar. So it's a way to look at sequences that are similar to other sequences.
And somehow people know it's just not random?
Right.
Okay, okay.
This was a new one for me that Grant put together for his tree ring work. So I know people who do some archaeology work, they use Gini coefficients quite a bit. I haven't run into Gini coefficients in any paleoclimate work that I've seen. So this is a relatively new tool that he's using for this tree ring reconstruction that I'm aware of.
Yeah, the barcode analogies, it sounds pretty good.
Right.
I have a quick question for you. In your 500 long tree ring reconstruction, what was the calendar year, radiocarbon year for the dye at the same time?
We don't have any radiocarbon dates for any of this wood.
Do you know like which MIS it was, isotope stage, or it's just floating?
Yeah, it's floating. So
Free-falling, okay.
Yeah, so yep, it's all floating. Pretty much all the wood we dated has come back radiocarbon dead. So
that is amazing that 10 trees
yes.
cross-dated and replicated, and you have no chronological constraints. That's amazing.
Right. Yeah. So it's, just to think like going into a forest today, just randomly picking up things and wood that's buried and then it's going to cross date is just kind of blows my mind. So
totally. Sean.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great talk. I just curious, looking forward into your stage 2, I was intrigued by the only one, hurricane, Cat 5, and
right.
all that time window. How are you thinking that you're going to be able to sort of make some traction on that particular aspect in phase 2, or is that not a focus of phase 2?
It is one of the things I'm interested at looking at in phase 2. Phase 2 will do quite a bit of modeling work. So one of the things one of our postdocs is doing is pulling all the geophysical data along the coast to kind of build a map to predict particular locations where we might have these depressions of backwater swamps where wood could be preserved. So with the coring work that we're doing, we're planning to go out and hit some of those locations, see if we can get the wood in our sediment cores, and then looking at the wood in detail to see if there's any shipworms or evidence that it's been exposed in the past. So that's what we'll be doing in phase 2, is really pulling that wood out. We have a paleobotanist who's going to go in and do some identification work on the wood, and then also the seeds. So that'll give us a better idea of what that forest looked like and what species were out there, but also going to look at the condition of the wood and to see if there's any evidence that it's been exposed in the past. So from the wood I've looked at so far that came out of the sediment cores, I don't see anything that looks like shipworms in it. So I don't think that wood has been exposed. So to think about, potentially 10,000 years, no Cat 5 with wave heights scoured out this particular site. I think doing the math on that, I think would be kind of an exciting project to do.
It also seemed like maybe matching that with some look, if you're in a back marsh kind of setting, whether or not you get some sand inundation or something like that, that would be an additional proxy, could be pretty cool.
Right. So no, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
John. John Gorbach, hands up.
Yes, back in the earlier part of the talk, she showed some tree stumps, cypress stumps in Louisiana that were from a cut-off section of a river, bayou or something like that. Is that something similar you're seeing with the depression that the stumps are in and the sand ridge off to one side out in the ocean now? Or
Right. Yeah, so this particular site, we're not too far from the Mississippi River. So I think this is, one of these bayou type situations. So potentially it could be, we do see what looks like a natural levee and the geophysical data that we have so far. So that potentially suggests, we could have had, these bayous shifting in their channels, maybe supplying the sediment from some type of flood event to it. So again, here in Baton Rouge, we're a good ways away from the coast here. So this is one, trying to find other studies that have found wood along the Gulf Coast. So I've been pulling these different things together, looking at, what people have thought had happened in the past as potential analogs for what we have at our site here offshore. So, but this particular site's really close to the Mississippi River. So over in Alabama, you know, we're a good distance away from the Mississippi River there, but we do have the Mobile River in that area.
Okay.
But yeah, the Mobile River is, you know, nothing, you know, it's a small river system and small watershed compared to the Mississippi River.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
But what's interesting though is, you know, since this work has come out and we've gotten a fair amount of press about it, and then also with the documentary, is whenever somebody finds wood when they're digging now, I get a phone call, which is really cool. So I've got lots of pieces of wood in my office from people, you know, doing oil well or water drilling, and they get down, you know, about 60 meters or so, or 20 meters, and they're hitting wood. So I've been collecting this information from land and that people have, you know, anecdotally told me about sites. And then working with Paul here from the Louisiana Geological Survey, he's got quite a record of places where people have reported wood. So we're pulling all of this information together to kind of put this picture together with our models to see, you know, potentially where do we have sites where this wood could be preserved over these types of timescales. And I didn't mention this in the talk, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, they're the agency that's funding this work. And the reason they're interested in it is from a marine archaeology standpoint, is, you know, what are the preservation characteristics of this site? And they want to know what are those characteristics, so that when they're doing their permitting work to kind of outline these places where we potentially could have trees preserved, but also potentially archaeological sites where we may have early human evidence as well. Because as we go back, you know, in time, trying to find earlier and earlier Paleo-Indian sites, those sites are now underwater if those people lived on the coastlines. So that was kind of the reason why our program manager wanted to fund this research.
Oh, very good. Thank you.
Okay, time for one last question. I'm not sure if the guests can raise their hand, so if a guest would like to ask a question, you can unmute and ask. I'll wait a moment to see if anyone has a question. Please identify yourself when you ask. Okay, looks like there's a phone who's unmuted, but I can't hear anyone speaking. All right. Maybe. Sean, you unmute. Anyone?
I just unmuted real quick just to note that everybody is a guest because they haven't actually logged in formally with their UTIG ID through Zoom. And it's something we'll probably have to do in the future as they tighten security.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Okay, well.
Ask a question in the chat.
Oh, I missed that. That was from a while back, Gail. Did you get a question, Kristine, from the chat?
I can't see the chat, so.
Ah, okay, roger that. Well, with that, it's 11:35. I will thank again, Kristine. Please feel free to virtually clap. Great talk. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for the, there we go, lots of claps.
Right.
Thank you all for joining, and we may have a seminar next week. I'm not sure. Anyhow, thank you for coming, stay safe, and we'll see you when we see you.
All right, thanks, bye. Bye, Jud.
Thanks, Kristine.
Bye, Kristine.
Bye.